Professor of Literary History at Barnard College, where he's taught since 1987. And his distinguished career includes 7 years at Harvard, decades of service at Columbia. Since 1997, Jim has served as the president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, a nonprofit dedicated to K-12 history and civic education across the country. A specialist in the Enlightenment, Jim's work explores the intersection of history and literature, covering topics from the Black Atlantic and abolition, the works of Samuel Johnson, and pioneering women writers. A former Rhodes Scholar, he's held fellowships at Yale, Cambridge, and the Morgan Library. And he continues to lead each summer Oxford Academia in the UK. And beyond all of his academic work, he serves on several prestigious boards, including the Society of American Historians and the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. And so Jim's most recent publication is Writers of the Founding Era, a comprehensive anthology, and it's a collection that features from more than 120 black writers between the years 1760 and 1820. And so following the presentation, Jim will be available in the back of the church. But now join me in welcoming Jim to Ascension this evening.
First thing I have to check and see if I'm audible to you. I don't trust the. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Sitting wherever you're sitting. Need more. Speak louder. Mic closer to mine. I'll try to speak loud enough. For people to hear. Father Carney, thank you. And I'm honored to be invited to speak here. As I was saying before the session began, I want to rely on the words of the people in this book. People I've tried to bring back into after a couple of centuries. Invisibility is a theme in the history of African countries in this country. Probably no more than in the founding era. The way we tend to remember the founding era, especially this year, 250th anniversary of the Declaration. I think it's important that we revisit that era. But the other theme with the way this parish has conducted itself. Father DeFell always emphasized inclusion, openness to everyone. One of the problems, the history of African American founding era was not just their condition at the time. Over the centuries since, there's been a tendency to deliberately exclude them. So on the handout, which has excerpts, which I'd like to go through to bring these voices alive. The first piece on this handout is not from the book that I'm about to talk about, which is Black Writers in Founding Era. It's from the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And those of you who remember the 1850s, the Dred Scott decision is still arguably the worst decision in the history of our country. Dred Scott had been an enslaved man who spent a period of years living in free states and territories in the north, then was returned to the south after almost 10 years, and applied for freedom, status of freedom, because I've lived all those years. The case made its way to the Supreme Court. They ruled, led by Justice Taney from Maryland, a notorious racist and pro-slavery advocate. Taney, the Chief Justice, wrote the opinion in which he not only ruled that Dred Scott could never escape from slavery, he would never be deemed a free man, but gratuitously, as you can read on your own in this passage, he added that black people had never been encompassed under the Declaration or the Constitution. They were not regarded as citizens of the United States and therefore had no standing, could not petition, could not be eligible for the protection of the court in any case. He was effectively excluding African Americans, not only from our history, but from the citizenship that they were entitled to in our country. So it's the absolute nadir of American history. Abraham Lincoln, 90 days later, wrote a formal protest or objection to this decision of the court. And he said not only was the decision wrong, but that Justice Taney was a bad historian because he had missed the fact that African Americans were not only present in the hundreds of thousands during the founding era, but they had conducted themselves very much as citizens. They had fought in the American Revolution, they had formed communities and formed churches, and they had social groups, they had filed petitions with courts. They had been everywhere present in the social and civic life of America in the founding era. Well, as you know, that went nowhere, and the 1850s led to our Civil War. But this book that I took 10 years to compile was rummaging in the archives to bring back these black voices that had been lost. So some of the pieces here were printed pieces found in newspapers or magazines or pamphlets. Some of them were manuscripts that turned up in archives. But out of hundreds of examples, I distilled about 200 texts in this book that is called Black Writers of the Founding Era. One of the first, if you all have a handout, to surface was Phyllis Wheatley. Now, many people today have, in the last 30 or 40 years, begun to remember Phyllis Wheatley, who was an extraordinary individual. She came as an enslaved child off a slave ship at the age of 7. She was purchased on the docks in Boston. God knows how the child has survived the transatlantic voyage. We know that about 25% of the slaves on that ship died in transit, so you can only imagine the trauma that she witnessed. But somehow she survived. She was purchased by a family in Boston, and she was raised within the household by a couple of rather enlightened people who educated her and treated her. She was being raised to be a servant to their daughter, but she proved so brilliant that she learned English in about 12 months. She started writing poems at the age of 11. And as a teenager, she was publishing poems in newspapers and magazines around Boston. When the American Revolution broke out, she was on the Patriot side. Living in Boston, she very much believed in American independence, and she became, over the course of the Revolutionary War, someone I call today the poet laureate of the American Revolution, because she wrote poem after poem about major figures on the American side. One of the first of which, in 1775, she wrote in honor of George Washington. So the way it happened was this. This excerpt is from a very long poem called To His Excellency George Washington. You'll see that it was written in 1775. She, with her family, was exiled in Providence because, of course, the British had occupied Boston, and it wasn't safe for independence-minded Americans to be there. But she heard, and of course, the war had broken out, and the American militias had besieged Boston. They were surrounded. And the American Congress appointed this colonel from Virginia, George Washington, to become commander-in-chief, who arrived in July of 1775. The point about this is she'd never met Washington. All she knew about him was what she read in the papers, that he was going to take command of these American forces. Nonetheless, she set out to write this great laudatory poem in his honor, which sounds just like this, and it's done in a very 18th century style. She says, "Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails." Columbia was the nickname for the United States. "Anon Britannia droops a pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead," thinking of Bunker Hill and the battle that had been there. "Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief," George Washington, "with virtue on thy side, thy every action let the goddess guide." She sent this poem to Washington in his camp up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we have documents that show Washington received the poem, and a couple of months later, during a complicated time when racial politics entered the American Revolution, he wrote back to her. Probably the only time in his life he addressed a letter to a black woman, to any black person. He wrote a very gracious response, praising her poetic talent, thanking her for all of the compliments, and even inviting her to come and visit him. We don't know that she ever did meet him in person. Some historians think she did, but he, meanwhile, arranged to have her poem published in the Virginia Gazette down in Virginia, where they had all kinds of rumblings of slave insurrections and trouble, because Washington wanted to harness her voice to kind of calm the restlessness in Virginia, because many of the enslaved people were going to the British side and fighting on their side. But meanwhile, what she had done was extremely dangerous. She'd written a poem in praise of the commander-in-chief of a rebellion army against the British Empire. If she'd been captured and known to be the author of this poem, she would have been considered a traitor. And who knows how she might have been treated. She continued to write poems like this in support of generals, in support of the American cause, right through the Revolution. She was never taken by British authorities, but you can see why I regard her. And it's ironic that a black woman was the poet laureate of the American Revolution. If you don't believe me, have a look in the book. There will be about 20 poems by her that show the case. I'm going to go through these quickly. I don't want to keep you here all evening, but I want you to hear the variety of these voices who are really quite startling. These are voices I never heard of in college or in high school myself. The second on the list here, Lemuel Haynes, is worthy of a feature film. Lemuel Haynes was a black man who had been abandoned as an infant, probably the product of a black father and white mother, but adopted by the deacon of a church in Granville, Massachusetts, and raised within that household as a kind of stepson and apprentice. And at about age 23, very Christian household, he's very well educated in that household. He's a member of the local militia. And suddenly they get word of this war breaking out up in Concord and Lexington. The militias are attacked. So they send word out to all the militias in Massachusetts and around to come. And he goes with his troops, with his fellow troops, he's about age 23 or so, to Boston, to the siege of Boston. He arrives about 2 days after the Battle of Lexington. But we know now that he wrote a poem called The Battle of Lexington, and he wrote it then, in 1775, probably based on information he got from soldiers who had been at the Battle of Lexington. The manuscript of this poem didn't turn up until the 1980s. Somehow it was lost in papers in an archive. But it is the first battlefield poem in American history. Again, not the first black battlefield poem, the first battlefield poem in American history at Concord and Lexington, written by a black man. He's more interesting than that. In the course of his time in the American Army, of course, the Declaration of Independence was published coming up from Philadelphia. And many of you remember that George Washington, as commander-in-chief, ordered that the Declaration be read aloud to all of his troops. Probably the first time in history that a commander-in-chief wanted his soldiers to hear the ideals that they were fighting for. Well, Lemuel Haynes, among all the other soldiers, heard and read the Declaration, and he immediately, in the excerpt that's here on this handout, set out to quote the Declaration, which he does in his motto. He said, "Behold these truths to be self-evident," and so on, talking about all men are created equal. He quotes that passage, and then he uses it as the motto for an essay calling for an end to slavery and for equal rights for black people in 1776, inspired by the Declaration. He's essentially saying, yes, these are great ideals. White people have called for them, and black people want them too. It's the beginning of the civil rights movement. We're used in American history to think about the civil rights movement beginning in the 1960s, or perhaps with Reconstruction after the Civil War. But when we think of Martin Luther King talking about the promissory note that has long been held out in America, he was referring to the Declaration. That's the promissory note, all men are created equal. It had never quite been fulfilled. Well, what I discovered in preparing this book was that the black community responded to the Declaration and its ideals immediately and quoted it and used it as the basis for arguing for their equality over and over again. I'll show you another example if you are following me closely, because good students will turn the page with me. On the second page of the handout, you'll see an excerpt from a petition dated January 13th, 1777. It's anonymous. It's a petition, quote, from a great number of Negroes who are detained in the state of slavery in the state of Massachusetts. And this petition they're presenting to the Massachusetts government, in which one of their lines, and it's just a tiny excerpt, they say, your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe has bestowed equally on all mankind, and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatever. It's January of 1777. This is 6 months after the Declaration, and they're talking about unalienable rights. They're using the language of the Declaration to say to the Massachusetts government, we're equal. So we're hearing these voices now. Suddenly, the founding era seems very different from what we've always thought. The next excerpt is equally remarkable for something historic that happened in it. It's written by an anonymous African American whose pamphlet was titled A Sermon on the Capture of Lord Cornwallis, published in 1782. He's referring actually to the Battle of Yorktown, when the last significant British army, of course, surrendered, and we knew that the war was won by the American side. And it's a wonderful piece of writing. We don't know who the man was, but he was a black minister, self-identified, from South Carolina, who was in Philadelphia. He had left South Carolina when the British occupied that state. And the pamphlet's very, very interesting for lots of reasons, but for me the most significant thing is that on the title page of this pamphlet, he identified himself as an African American. It is the first use of the term African American in our history. And until I found this pamphlet, the Oxford English Dictionary recorded the earliest use of that phrase as 1835, 50 years later. But actually, here's this man just at the end of the American Revolution. And the significance is not that he's differentiating himself from Americans. Black people in the founding era were often called Ethiopians or Africans. And he's insisting, I'm not just an African, I'm an African American. In other words, he uses that term to include himself and his people in the body politic of the United States. It's a remarkable usage, and you all go and check the book out of the library, and it has one in her library. You'll see this pamphlet. But the next piece is particularly moving. You'll see these clustered around the 1780s, but a petition from Belinda Sutton in Massachusetts in 1783. Her story is also worth a film, and if any of you are storytellers, filmmakers, whatever you might do in a creative way, I hope you'll pick up some of these stories. Belinda was enslaved for 50 years. She was brought from the Caribbean as about a 12-year-old child and was enslaved by a man called Isaac Royal, very wealthy, with Caribbean property and big Massachusetts property, lots of wealth and shipping back and forth. But he was a loyalist. And when the revolution broke out, he decamped to England. And eventually his property was confiscated by the state of Massachusetts, which could be done under the laws at that time. He was a very prominent figure. He'd gone to Harvard College, and he was a big donor to Harvard and so on. But with him having left, she found a clerk who was willing to file a petition to the state of Massachusetts asking for a stipend or a pension paid from his property, which had now been taken by the state of Massachusetts. In other words, this is the first petition for reparations in American history. I'm owed something for my 50 years of unpaid work. Now, she was almost certainly illiterate, so this petition was drafted by a very sympathetic clerk or lawyer, we don't know who uses rather ornate language, which you can read, but I'm not going to trouble you with it at the moment. I want to give you the long story outcome. She petitioned, she was granted a pension by the state, something like 16 pounds a year. 2 years later, there's a record she had to come back and petition again because the court had ordered it, but the people who were managing Royal's property failed to pay it. She came back 5 times over the next 12 years. So even when a court would order something like this, it were others down the chain of command who would just ignore the order until she went back to court. But there's a consequence even further down the line. She was also caring for a disabled child, actually, at this point as well. But in the 21st century, not so long ago, Harvard Law School was embarrassed to discover that historically, money from Isaac Royal, had been set aside to start the law school, which they did in the early 1800s. And when they started the law school, they created a crest, and they incorporated some of the emblems from Isaac Royal's personal crest. And it wasn't until 2017 that some good, attentive scholar noticed that the Harvard Law School was proudly displaying the crest of a slaveholding loyalist from the founding era. You can go look it up in the New York Times. There was a bit of a to-do about it. And of course, sheepishly, they had to pull down their crest and redesign it so that it didn't carry this crazy symbolism. But it's the way that some of these things persist. And Belinda Sutton's life, one can hardly imagine what she endured. If we go to the next petition, also from 1783, it's actually an editorial written in a Maryland magazine called the Maryland Gazette. And again, the anonymous author calls himself Vox Africanorum, the African voice, the voice of Africa. He's confronting Americans in 1783. The country has just got its independence, and already he's confronting the American government with the hypocrisy of continuing slavery, and he's quoting the Declaration to do so. It's in this excerpt, he says, attend to your, he's a rather eloquent writer too. We still don't know who he is quite, but he's a self-identified black man in Baltimore. Attend to your own declarations. These truths are self-evident. All men are created equal. They are endowed, and so forth, so forth. He quotes them, and he says, we shall offer no arguments. Nay, it would be insulting to the understanding of America at this enlightened period to suppose she stood in need of arguments to prove our right to liberty. It's obvious. It would be to suppose that she has already forgot those exalted principles she has so lately asserted with her blood. So this kind of protest is beginning immediately with the birth of our country, and it's coming in very eloquent ways. A similar protest in the next passage from Benjamin Banneker, who was never a slave. His parents had been, but he was a free man and a self-taught mathematician, surveyor, scientist, a really, really brilliant autodidact, some of whose discoveries descend to us today. He was also a principled man, and in 1791, he had the courage to write a letter to Thomas Jefferson. Those of you who've seen Hamilton will remember that Jefferson has just become part of the American government as Secretary of State. Banneker publishes a letter to Jefferson, rather politely phrased, might be different today. Well, there are a great variety of voices in this book. Some of them are published, as I say, some come from private manuscripts. And some of the personal manuscripts open a window on life in this period that can be extremely painful and shows some of the sufferings of ordinary people. And such is this letter of Sarah Peters, who's the next person. Sarah Peters was married to a man named Thomas Peters. Both of them were formerly enslaved. Both of them went over to the British side early in the Revolution. And the British actually formed black units of black soldiers. They were called black pioneers and other phrases. And Thomas Peters was a sergeant who led one of the fiercest of these units in the British Army and fought for, we think, most of 7 years. And so when the British evacuated eventually, they took thousands of these people with them. Some they had taken in earlier voyages, but actually if you go to Fraunces Tavern here in New York, where the final negotiations were conducted, there were 3,000 African Americans in British custody or sheltering within the British community who were taken with them to Nova Scotia at the end of the war. And of course, the negotiations were all about these slaveholders from Virginia and elsewhere coming and wanting to reclaim their slaves who'd escaped to the British side. And the British, to their credit, said, no, we granted these people freedom to be with us, and we're honoring that, and they're coming with us. So there were 3,000 formerly enslaved black people. Thomas and Sarah were in that group. They went to Nova Scotia in 1783. November of 1783, and for about 8 years struggled to make a living there. There are still descendants of some of the black communities that formed there in the 18th century. Thomas Peters was a very active man in the community, a recognized leader, and he corresponded with the British government and arranged for a kind of deliverance, a second exodus for people from Nova Scotia who wanted a fresh start because they were struggling. The climate was tough, the soil was rocky, the other whites were not very welcoming, they had a tough, tough time. So in 1792, 1,500 former African Americans, now British Empire citizens in Nova Scotia, loaded up on ships and moved to Sierra Leone. So a second crossing of the Atlantic, but to a community now near Freetown that would be their own. I give you all that background because here's this long, heroic struggle of Thomas and Sarah to build a life together. They had children and so on. They arrived in Sierra Leone. He was a recognized leader of the community. And a few weeks after they arrived, he died. And she's there with 7 children. And this is the letter. I don't know how this survived, somewhere in the British archives. She wrote with his body in the room, just having died. She's writing to the authorities, the British authorities who were helping to oversee the settlement, asking for certain supplies. And as you read the letter, you'll see what the supplies are for. She says, "Sir, it's June 25th, 1792. This is to beg the favor of you to let me have a gallon of wine, 1 gallon of porter, and 1/2 gallon of rum, 2 pounds candles, 5 yards of white linen. My husband is dead, and I am in great distress. I apply for the above things. My children is all sick. My distress is not to be equaled. I remain afflicted, Sarah Peters." Well, the white linen is the giveaway. That's a shroud for his body. And she wants candles. And she's asking for liquor to serve the mourners who will be coming because he was well known in the community. But here's this destitute widow who's gone through this tremendous ordeal with her own children sick and her husband lying dead, and she doesn't even have candles or something to serve people who come. So this is an example of how some of these texts, when we reclaim them, open an angle of vision on the lives of people in circumstances that are otherwise really hard for us to imagine. I'm going to skip the next one, which is a petition about the poll tax in South Carolina, because it won't surprise anybody that there were poll taxes in South Carolina in the 1790s on black people. It won't surprise anybody to hear that there were poll taxes all the way to this Civil War. and the tax was for being black. Sometimes we talk today about driving while black. Well, people were taxed for being black per capita in the household. And the petition that I just skipped was co-signed by white farmers in the same community. So there were moments when we might have had much more racial equality and harmony, but those opportunities passed. I want to touch on Patty Gibson's letter on the next page, which is another personal revelation. This letter turned up in the Pennsylvania Historical Society among some manuscripts there. Patty Gibson is an enslaved woman in a rural county in North Carolina. Her letter, you see, is dated in November of 1797. And her letter, which is addressed to her husband, apparently in Philadelphia, who probably had escaped from North Carolina. And she had tried to go to join him, but she got caught. And she's describing her situation and begging for help from people in Philadelphia. Dear husband, I now take this opportunity to inform you that I am well at this time and hope this will find you the same. I should be very glad if you will come and fetch me some money by the 1st of January, as I expect to be sold then. And if you could help me to some money, you will much oblige me, as I have set off once but got caught and brought back and put in the sale. I hope you will try and do the best for me you can, as I want to see you very much. Remember me to all my friends, and I remain your ever and assured wife and well-wisher to this day. Now, this is the only piece of writing we have by Patty Gibson. We don't know for sure what happened, but think of the drama. It's rural North Carolina, November 10th. She's going to be put in a sale on the 1st of January. This letter has to go by whatever means to Philadelphia and then reach her husband or friends, and they need to round up the money and then somehow get it to North Carolina in time to save her from being sold. To this day, I don't know what happened to her. But I try to use, historians' kind of circumstantial evidence. The fact that the letter was kept in an archive with other abolitionist papers in Philadelphia suggested it certainly got there. In that same file are other documents written about various men with the surname Gibson. So there were men there, and in the same file. I'm very hopeful that they did find the money and did get it to North Carolina, and she lived her life as a free woman. But we may never know. You see why this has been so interesting to me in terms of opening up these lives, but I also feel there's a whole realm of research that the next generation of students and scholars and writers should go after. Some of you have heard of Venture Smith, perhaps. This excerpt from his narrative of the life and adventures of Venture, a native of Africa, was published in 1798. It's one of the first slave narratives. In this book are 12 different slave narratives, beginning with one in 1760. His is the last of them. We often think of Frederick Douglass, his famous slave narrative from 1845. His first, he had 3 different autobiographies, but the first one in 1845, a very famous one, we think of it as the first slave narrative. Well, actually, he was building on a tradition that was already very well established. It's just that his was one of the most eloquent and popular as a bestseller. Venture Smith came from Africa as a young man, as a teenager. He was a great success story. He achieved his freedom, Long Island and Connecticut. He built up business, he owned property. He did a lot. This, near the end of his life, he dictated to a white friend, a Yale graduate, who wrote down this story and published it. He says in the final paragraph, I am now 69 years old, though once straight and tall, measuring without shoes 6 feet 1 inch and a half, and every way well proportioned. He was famously big and strong. I am now bowed down with age and hardship. My strength, which was once equal, if not superior, to any man whom I've ever seen, is now enfeebled, so that life is a burden, and it is with fatigue that I can walk a couple of miles, stooping over my staff. My eyesight has gradually failed till I am almost blind, and whenever I go abroad, one of my grandchildren must direct my way. Besides, for many years I have been much pained and troubled with an ulcer on one of my legs. But amidst all my griefs and pains, I have many consolations. Meg, the wife of my youth, whom I married for love and bought with my money, she had been enslaved, is still alive. And his last sentence, my freedom is a privilege which nothing else can equal. I encourage you to go read his story. It's a truly amazing book, and I'm sad that it isn't more widely read in schools and college courses. The passage from Richard Allen, another churchman. I feel good talking about Richard Allen in a church. He's the founder of the AME Church, former slave from Delaware, who in the 1790s established the AME Church in a barn, actually, or in a blacksmith shop in Philadelphia, but became the leader of the AME Church, a very respected leader in the black community, politically as well as in the church. When George Washington died in December 15th of 1799, it was a momentous occasion. Some people are aware that in his will, Washington meticulously arranged for the slaves that he owned to be freed and educated and trained up to be economically self-sufficient. He could not legally free the slaves that his wife didn't actually own them. They were held in a complicated dowry that would revert to her family when she died, and he was simply the legal attendant. But he did arrange to free his own slaves. And if you read his will, there's a very interesting passage where he insists that they be educated. Richard Allen got up 2 weeks later and delivered to his congregation one of the first eulogies in honor of George Washington. It's the first eulogy in honor of Washington by any black person in America. In it, he encouraged his congregation to think of themselves as fellow Americans mourning the father of the country, and whatever their differences, because he picks up on what had been published about Washington's will, freeing his slaves. He talks here about how this mournful event, an event in which we participate in common with the feelings of a grateful people, they're aligning them with the other American people who are mourning this president. And the reason is, if he who broke the yoke of British burdens from off the neck of the people of this land and was hailed as his country's deliverer, by what name shall we call him who secretly and almost unknown emancipated his bondmen and bondwomen, becoming to them a father, and gave them an inheritance? Deeds like this are not common. So he's signaling that Washington should be respected in the black community for freeing his slaves, even on his deathbed, because that's so unusual. Above all, he's encouraging them to think of themselves as part of the American body politic. The last text I'm going to mention, and I'm sorry to go on so long with you, but I'm happy to open up for questions and discussion. There are a lot more where these came from. But the last one is, in a way, one of the most powerful and at the same time most disappointing. It's a petition by the people of color, freemen in Philadelphia, presented to the U.S. Congress. Remember, Philadelphia in 1799 is our capital. And this petition was signed by 71 free men in Philadelphia. And in it, they quote the Constitution. Again, they turn to the American founding documents to say, in the Constitution and the Fugitive Bill, no mention is made of black people or slaves. Therefore, if the Bill of Rights or the Declaration issued by Congress are of any validity, we beseech that as we are men, we may be admitted to partake of the liberties and unalienable rights therein held forth, firmly believing that the extending of justice and equity to all classes would be a means of drawing down the blessings of heaven upon this land, for the peace and prosperity of which, and the real happiness of every member of the community, we fervently pray. So in the book, I have reproduced the page on which the 71 signatures appear because I think it's one of the most significant documents I've ever seen. There are 71 signatures. Only 21 of them are written by the person himself. The other 50 are names written around an X. In other words, 50 of the signers were illiterate and had to put an X, and a clerk filled in their name. But they wanted their name on the petition. What does it mean to be a free black man? Remember, Philadelphia is the place where the signers of the Declaration were brave because they were risking their lives to sign a Declaration of Independence that the British could hang them for doing. What does it mean when 71 free black men, who may have not so long ago escaped from South Carolina, North Carolina, Delaware, somewhere, put their names on a petition in the same town where that Congress is meeting, and that petition goes down the street, is presented to Congress? It's an act of unbelievable courage, I think, to do that. The petition has a dramatic but disappointing history. It was actually presented to Congress by a congressman, we're never surprised, from Massachusetts. A lot of these things begin in Massachusetts. A congressman called Thatcher, who was anti-slavery. And this petition was debated for 2 days in Congress. And you can find quotations from some of the proceedings, but it was very predictable. Georgia, South Carolina, the Southern congressmen got up and reviled it, and full of racist comments on no way they could be our equal, blah, blah, blah. And this petition was voted down 85-1. Thatcher from Massachusetts. Imagine what might have happened if they had done anything else. If they had actually debated the merits of this petition, if they'd taken any more moderate position, if they had begun to reform anything. Because in the 1790s, we still had hope. States in the North had been abolishing slavery or passing gradual emancipation acts steadily, beginning in Massachusetts in 1783, actually Vermont in 1777, Pennsylvania in 1780, and so on. The North was rolling up anti-slavery measures. The Northwest Territory in 1787, George Washington signed the legislation that created the Northwest Territory, from which slavery was banned. And 5 states would come from the Northwest Territory. There was momentum, in other words. And we didn't yet have the Louisiana Purchase. We didn't yet have the cotton gin that would make cotton 50 times more profitable as a crop. We didn't have the rich soil of Alabama and Georgia and all the places that would become the center of wealth in America all the way down in the 1840s and 50s. Imagine if this petition had been taken more seriously at the time. It's one of the great lost opportunities, I think, in the history of the country. So I'm sorry to leave you with that sad note, but it's also a lesson to us about the contingency of history. Maybe we think a little bit about the contingencies of the moments that we're living in right now. But I certainly hope you'll think differently in the future about the presence and the variety of people, black people, in the founding era in America, and all that they did in terms of claiming civil rights, building communities, self-help, mutual aid societies, churches, the first black churches, built largely because they'd been excluded from white Christian churches. So much of the development of the black community took off in this period. And yet on the eve of the Civil War, the Supreme Court was trying to say, no, they weren't really ever part of the country. So inclusion, which is so profoundly important. Inclusion is the idea that I leave you with. I'm happy to answer questions about any aspect of this or any part of the book. Yes?
So first, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. I've been fascinated by the name Elizabeth Freeman.
Sorry, the name?
Elizabeth Freeman.
Yes. Mumbet Freeman.
I read about her in Ladies of Liberty by Pippa Roberts.
Well, she was a petitioner for freedom in Massachusetts.
Right, and she won.
Yes, she did. Yes.
Did she have any writings? I don't know, because her case was cited for the case where Massachusetts.
1783. It was the decision that effectively ended slavery. Massachusetts is a place where they never had slavery on the books, so when the courts said, you're free, the precedent was set. We don't have slavery in Massachusetts, and hers was the case. 1783.
The setting is fascinating because she was a slave servant in a house of attorneys. And she heard them discussing the formation of the Massachusetts Constitution.
Yes.
And when she or her slave woman was going to be hit by the mistress, after she decided, she went to the house of her attorney to get him to petition against her owners.
Yes.
I just was like, and she got reparations.
Yes.
I mean, I'm just like, this woman, doing that.
It's remarkable how many people there were like that.
And that she heard it. They couldn't hide that freedom was in the land.
That's exactly right. And that's why so many of these people heard the Declaration or read the Declaration or overheard people in the household talking about the Declaration. It was everywhere. It was broadcast, the idea of freedom, and black people immediately took it up. The response of the white establishment is what's disappointing. Although there were white allies, there were lawyers who would represent people, and there were abolitionists already at this time. And in fact, before the Revolutionary War, there were people like Anthony Benezet in Philadelphia and a lot of the Quakers who were writing against slavery and campaigning for an end, calling in Quaker meetings for good Quakers to free their slaves. And there was a division in the Quaker church, where, because principal Quakers often didn't accept slaveholders and vice versa in their congregations. So there was a movement moving ahead, It's my view, I did another volume for Library of America. This book was published by Library of America too, but 10 years earlier I did a volume on American anti-slavery writing. So when did people begin to write against slavery? Well, it turns out in 1688, there were Quakers already writing petitions and submitting them to colonial governments, protesting slavery. So the idea that slavery was wrong was a long time brewing. And of course, governments are always the lowest common denominator. They're always behind the sentiments of the people. I'm a student of literature, and I firmly believe that, as I wrote in another book, poets were the people who really drove the anti-slavery movement, because they created the sensibilities, the attitudes among people that slavery was wrong, that black people were human. But it took a long time for those ideas to become powerful enough that these elected officials, who are often influenced by moneyed interests, would finally do things in courts and in legislatures to end slavery. One of the telltale signs of the power of anti-slavery literature is that in all of the southern states, beginning in about 1820, all the southern slaveholding states passed laws, censorship laws, against not just writing or publishing, but owning anti-slavery writings of any kind. They called it incendiary literature. And there were people sent to prison in 1852 for owning a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin in Maryland, which was a slaveholding state. But none of the northern states passed censorship laws against pro-slavery literature. In other words, the South was losing the battle of ideas, and they could feel it. There were, the Georgia legislature in 1830 was so angry about a book written by a black man in Massachusetts, calling for, equal rights for black people all over the world, that they passed legislation putting a bounty on his head. This is a black writer up in Boston. Imagine the Georgia legislature. They have other things to do, but they're so concerned about the power of this incendiary literature, they put a bounty on his head, offering $10,000 if he's captured and $1,000 if he's killed. So the power of literature is evident there. How are we going to shut this down? Because we need to shut it down. Even during the Civil War, was when Victor Hugo published Les Miserables, which is, of course, famous now as a Broadway show. Victor Hugo was well known as a popular novelist all over the world. So when he published Les Miserables in about 1861, it's immediately translated in London, in Boston, and New York into English. Well, the Civil War's underway by the time it's coming to Richmond, Virginia, but the Southerners, even though the Civil War's going on, think they need to have their own translation. So there was an edition translated in Richmond, Virginia in 1862, but the translator and the editor edited out all the anti-slavery passages and openly said in the introduction, we reckon that our readers will be offended by reading these passages. In other words, while they had soldiers in the field shooting each other to preserve slavery, they were still afraid of Victor Hugo's influence as an anti-slavery writer in the South. I mean, there's incredible evidence of the power of imaginative literature, of writing, to change culture and change sensibilities, and that always happens before legislators get around to doing anything. We live in a time when legislators are not doing very much. Other questions? Yes.
I can't help but believe that R&D with Ken Burns.
He's a friend. He's actually a trustee of the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Yeah, tell me why you say that.
Well, could you repeat the question? Yeah.
Oh, I'm accused of being in league with Ken Burns, which I'll confess to. Yes. Tell me why you thought that.
No, well, because he's been so educated. Well, he's educated us on the American Revolution, how blacks have, African Americans have been very influential throughout history.
Yes.
How we have not just built this country, we were intricate
Absolutely.
part of this country.
Yes.
And
It's tough, I know. Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates, who is also a trustee, and he's a very close personal friend, has been for a long time, in the early 1990s, discovered that he was descended from black men in West Virginia who had fought in the American Revolution. And he gained admission to an organization called the Sons of the American Revolution, which up to that point had been all white. And I'm proud to say today, both the Sons of the American Revolution and the Daughters of the American Revolution, which base their membership on proven genealogy, you have to be descended from somebody who fought in the war, they both have black members now, and growing numbers, and they actually welcome black members. So when we look for signs of inclusion, but also of systemic change that are hopeful, that's one I would point to. Because those organizations now see the American Revolution as something, and we know that at least 5,000 black men, but you think perhaps as many as 8,000 fought on the American side during the Revolutionary War. And we know that from petition records, because later veterans would have to prove, or their widows would have to prove they had fought in the war. So there's testimony in these written petitions about where they fought and so on. And so we're finding evidence from that and from other sources and building out a record of the black men who fought the American Revolution. But imagine that as a credential for citizenship. I should have told you that Lemuel Haynes, who's one of my heroes, and I don't know if anybody here makes films, but if one guy is crying out for a film to be made, it's Lemuel Haynes, who is so brilliant. It's a 23-year-old guy. He's writing this petition about equal rights. He's writing a poem about the Battle of Lexington. After the war, he went on and trained to be a minister. Congregationalist minister, and for 30 years he had a white congregation in Vermont. He actually married a white woman, and they had 10 children. And believe it or not, they lived in this community in Vermont for 30 years. And he was an ardent Federalist. He is supposed to, the priests in the room ought to love this, he's supposed to have composed and delivered 5,000 sermons in his life. I don't know how many of you guys are holding in your files. But he was very eloquent and very active. He wrote essays in support of the Federalist political party. He was the first black man in America to get an honorary degree in 1804. So he went on from those humble beginnings, and as a soldier in the American Revolution, to be a leader in his community and a major contributor. And I've got him back in print. You know, he hasn't been in print since the 1700s. So I'm really pleased to do that. Is there a question? Yeah.
When the ladies,
Anti-Slavery Society? Yes. There was a women's anti-slavery group in Philadelphia.
Yes.
Yeah.
And how he contributed to women's rights and suffrage.
Absolutely. He also was at the convention at Seneca Falls in 1848, which was the birth of the women's rights movement. And Frederick Douglass was very, very progressive about equal rights for women. I mean, he's like Abraham Lincoln. He's one of the most astonishing autodidacts. You have no idea where this brilliant brain came from because he received no formal education. He was self-taught. But he thought in very sophisticated ways. He understood about civil rights for everyone. So he embraced the women's rights movement. But it's one of the paradoxes of American history that the progressives sort of made a decision. They felt they couldn't pursue women's rights and civil rights for blacks at the same time. So they postponed women's rights, as you know, and focused on civil rights and the abolition movement for black people. But after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, out west, I think Wyoming and a couple of other western states granted women the right to vote, and state by state the pressure began, and the women's rights movement, of course, led to the voting rights of women, for women in 1920. But they were deferred in favor of the campaign for equal rights for blacks. Douglass cooperated in that. You know, there needed to be political cooperation and unity. I'm glad you spotted that. Yes?
Two things. First, when you talked about Lemuel Haynes,
Yes.
you said, just mentioned that he became a minister.
Yes.
And in the African American community, he is recognized as the first black man to be ordained as a minister in the United States, the first one.
To be ordained, yes.
Yes, to be ordained.
That's a
He was
great
the
point.
first.
Yes, thank you.
And the second thing I'd like to ask you, throughout your talk you kept saying, what if? Is there any event or words here you think that have been likely to change the course of history? I mean, clearly Tagg's decision in Dred Scott sent it back
Yeah.
a long way.
Yep.
Is there any event or any words you thought, when you keep saying what if, you
Yep.
thought could have or might have changed history?
Yes. I think the petitions in Massachusetts in 1776 and 77 and Lemuel Haynes' writing were circulating ideas in Massachusetts, particularly, but in New England, that were finding resonance in the minds of people there. Now, there were, as early as the Puritans, people who had misgivings about slavery and felt that it might be wrong. Justice Samuel Sewall Nicole is here, and she helped me compose this book, and she knows more of it than I do, was a Puritan minister. Wild story. In the 1690s, he's a Harvard-educated Puritan minister. He's one of the judges at the Salem witch trials. But he's the only one of the judges at the Salem witch trials that 5 years later recanted and said we were wrong. He publicly repented. And 3 years later, that was 1697, in his diary, private diary, he writes that I have long had misgivings about our treatment of the Africans, because of course there were slaves coming in even to Boston. And publicly, he wrote a petition on behalf of an enslaved man called Adam, who was owned by another Bostonian, and he tried to help him gain his freedom. Failed. But what I'm saying is that in 1697 and 1700, there were already places in Massachusetts, maybe other places of conscience, where that feeling was coming up. It's never, in my reading of history, it's never as simple as, someone writes an editorial and a president or a legislature says, oh, okay, I get it, I'm going to change my vote. But the fact that in Massachusetts there was so much activity that there's a petition for reparations, there's a petition by Mumbet, there's a petition by these anonymous people, there's Lemuel Haynes, there's Phyllis Wheatley, who's a Bostonian. No accident that they were one of the first places to abolish slavery in 1783 in a court decision. So I can't point to, one document, one event, but I can feel the gradual shift in temperament that leads to actions. In New York, there's more than I can go into here, but in New York, there's a black man called William Hamilton, who's a leader of the abolitionist movement. He's a carpenter, and he writes a letter to John Jay in 1796. Very articulate, eloquent letter, all reasoning about why John Jay should support the abolition of slavery and New York State should abolish it. And John Jay, he chose because Jay was a co-founder with Alexander Hamilton of the Manumission Society in New York, which was a group of whites who were campaigning to end slavery. Well, John Jay was by that time governor of New York, and in 1799, he signed legislature that was a gradual Emancipation Act that said New York is going to end slavery over this period of time. The last slave wasn't freed in New York until 1827. But I think that letter was influential. I think it helped Jay to feel there's a black community here, educated people, and they're pressing on public officials to let us in as equals. So that's kind of the way that I explore history. I can't find really quick fixes, but I do feel that the writers and petitioners and citizens campaigns make a difference. We think of how long the civil rights campaign was in this country in the 1960s, and how things came so slowly and with so much resistance, until finally the balance was tipped. And of course, as we're feeling right now, all of that progress is precarious. And we all need to do what we can to push forward with better ideas. But thank you for raising that question, because it's important. Anything else? Yes? I am so glad you asked that. So, the question is education and how, through the educational system, we can make more of these stories, these life stories, visible. And I know there are educators in the room. I don't know if there are other teachers in the room, but definitely, you're the people. I work at the Gilder Lehrman Institute. We have 110,000 teachers on our registered with us for materials. A couple of years ago when this book came out, we arranged with Library of America to get paperback copies, and we distributed them to 6,000 teachers across the country. And every chance I get like this, and thank you for inviting me, I ask if there are people who teach or who write children's stories or who make films or write plays. I have met with producers of plays, and I'm relentless about this. Producers of plays where I've given them the book and I say, you know all these creative people, give them these stories because they're incredible, you know. So I'm pushing, but you're gonna leave here and do something about it, so I feel like that's one. Any of these pieces that will be in classrooms or in students' minds or later in films will help us go forward.
Jim, before we finish, maybe you could just say about a word about how you have partnered with a Hamilton Broadway musical with Gilder Lehrman.
So one of the great blessings for us at Gilder Lehrman is in 2015, Luis Miranda and Ron Chernow and the producers of Hamilton came into our office and said, we want you, Gilder Lehrman Institute, we know you do history education and Ron Chernow knows you well. We want you to develop a curriculum that will make Hamilton an educational experience for kids. Long story short, we developed a website with primary source documents and a curriculum. Rockefeller gave us a $1.5 million grant, and for 10 years we have been running a program for kids in the tri-state area initially from poor schools, Title I schools, although we're working on Catholic schools soon, to do this curriculum. And what happens is the kids, either in pairs or on their own, go into the website after they've been studying the founding era and they pick a historical figure. And we have 3 documents connected with that figure. Some of them are in the show, Jefferson, Washington. Others are people not in the show, Phyllis Wheatley, Benjamin Banneker, Lemuel Haynes. We put all of them in the resources. The kids have to write not an essay or a research paper, they have to write a poem or a song or a rap piece or a dramatic scene, a creative piece in the voice of these people. And that's their ticket to the show. And so several times a year, the producers of Hamilton give us the whole matinee performance. Today's Thursday, we just had one yesterday. So yesterday, I was with the Chancellor of the Department of Education at Hamilton, and the theater had 1,300 inner city kids and their teachers who had done this curriculum, but of course they're poor kids. They've never been in a Broadway theater. The experience is, you've been there.
Been there.
It's unbelievable because these kids are so excited and they have no filter. They're responding completely to what they see in front of them. And then afterwards, there's a Q&A with 8 members of the cast. I've done this 120 times, and it's still the most exhilarating experience you can imagine. You want something hopeful for our time. That's been going on. And when COVID hit, we moved the curriculum online, and it's available nationally, free to kids everywhere, in any school in America. And we run a national competition where the kids out there who are not in the tri-state area, they do their acts and they send them in as video clips, and then we have a panel of judges who choose 10 acts on merit and 10 acts by lottery, so anybody who enters has a chance, and we fly the winning acts, might be 2 or 3 kids and their parents, to New York to see Hamilton. And yesterday we had about 80 of those people in the front row of the theater, and you've never seen such excitement. Kids from Kansas and Idaho and Nevada, you know, and the whole thing is mind-blowing. So Hamilton has been one of the great gifts, and I have to say about the Mirandas. In fact, Luce Miranda might come here to Mass on
I know that
She's
we're waiting
interested.
for.
The Mirandas have joined our board of trustees for years. They are an incredible family. They drove this whole process, and when we were building the curriculum, Lynn Miranda himself looked at every piece of it as we were developing it. He wanted it to be just right. And in the early days of the program, he would be in the theater and greet the kids and answer questions and things. We just had a big meeting with foundations to try to plan the next 10 years. If anybody has a couple of million here, we're looking for $20 million over the next 10 years to make this program reach more. But we estimate that about 1 million kids nationally have experienced the curriculum. So, you know, we're hoping kids turn 18 and they go out and they become our fellow citizens. So What are we doing to make them enthusiastic participants, in the body politic? We have to give them something to be excited about, and that's one thing we're trying. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your great work. Thank you. Thank you. And Jim will be available in the back of the church, and there's some books in the back of the church as well. So, thank you, Jim.
Great. I never thought I'd get to, I wanted to be a priest when I was 8. I never got this. Well, I don't know if it'll always be a good feeling. I'm not very good at funerals, I gotta say. Absolutely right. And we now have to take recipients. When they think about the founding era, they don't think of some white guy in the statue. They think of Chris Jackson. They think of Rick Hansen, Black Adam. That's who George